Hey guys, tonight we're going back, way back, to the frosty edge of the known world. You're trudging through knee-deep snow, beneath a pewter sky, the wind slicing at your cheeks like a whetted blade. A thatched roof longhouse squats ahead, half buried in frost, smoke curling lazily from its central chimney hole. Welcome to winter in a Viking village. Before you drift off, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It really helps me create more great content for you. Only if you're enjoying what I do, of course, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. By the way, what time is it where you are, and where in the world are you watching from? Let's make this peaceful space even better together. Now relax, and let's begin. You probably won't survive this. It's not the raids or the cold that'll get you. It's the menu, because tonight we're exploring what Vikings really ate to get through the coldest months of the year. And let's just say, if you're craving warm pastries and rich broths, you may want to lower those expectations. Think dried fish, goat's milk, gone tangy, and bread. You might confuse for a roofing tile. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the longhouse, and the air immediately changes from biting cold to a dense wood smoke-warmed stillness. Your nose twitches. It's not quite comforting. There's an unmistakable tang of old fish. You blink through the gloom and spot it. Strips of cod and herring dangling from beams, cured with smoke and wind, seasoned by months of patient ignoring. These are stockfish, and they'll be your new best friend. For the next several months, Vikings didn't have fridges. Obviously, what they did have was ingenuity and salt. Mountains of salt, salted and dried fish caught in bulk during the warmer seasons were strung up or buried in snowbanks and pulled out one chewy piece at a time. It's said you had to soak some pieces for a day just to make them chewable. But even then, your jaw got more of a workout than your stomach did. Still preserved, fish was a winter lifeline. Herring, salmon, cod. These fish swam not just in fjords, but in the veins of the Viking diet. You'd eat them roasted, boiled, or if supplies were low, just gnawed on cold while huddled under a bearskin. Sometimes they were so dry, they sparked like flint when you bit into them. Historians still argue whether the Viking use of preservation was driven more by necessity or by culinary tradition. Some claim it was an art form passed down through generations. Others think it was just what you did when your entire pantry was a snowbank and your kitchen tools consisted of a knife, a pot, and whatever you could dry on a stick. Nearby, a man thumps a sack onto the floor. It's full of fish heads. You watch as he sets them by the hearth. No part of the catch was wasted. Heads were stewed bones boiled, and fish skins once crisped were like Viking potato chips, except sharper and less fun. And if you were really lucky, you got lutefisk. Picture this: dried whitefish, rehydrated in water, then soaked in lye. Yes, the caustic chemical. Then rinsed until it was edible by some loose medieval definition. It ends up jiggly, translucent, and unnervingly neutral in flavor. Kind of like seafood-flavored jelly wearing a ghost costume. There's also the salted lamb, which will make more of a cameo later. But just know that meat, especially fresh, was rare in the cold season. unless something died of natural causes, or you had a serious party planned. You walk past the hearth and peer into the food cache baskets of dried peas, hazelnuts, and bitter apples, so wrinkled they look more like curses than fruit. None of this is glamorous, but it worked. People lived, farmed, sailed, and raided on this diet. You sit beside a woman turning a hunk of fish over the coals she's humming. Her hair smells of wood smoke and ash. She offers you a bit of fish on a splintered plank. It's smoky, tough, but there's salt and fire in it, and after a day of chopping ice or hauling nets, you'd call it a feast. You lean back, belly half full of what your stomach hasn't yet decided to reject, and watch shadows flicker across the walls. You're alive, you're warm, and even if the food's a bit chewy, it means you've made it one more night on the edge of the world. You wake up, with your cheek pressed to a straw mat, the fire long since faded to embers. Outside, the wind howls like a hungry god, but inside the longhouse, a soft clatter draws you to the central hearth. A wooden ladle stirs in a clay pot, and the scent wafting up is tangy creamy, almost alive. Welcome to breakfast goat's milk and sour porridge. Vikings didn't just rely on fish to get through winter. They leaned heavily on their livestock. If the goats hadn't frozen, wandered off, or become stew, they were still providing milk. And milk in the absence of refrigeration didn't stay milk for long. It curdled, it soured, it thickened into clumps. And that's exactly how they liked it. You sip from a wooden cup, filled with surmjölk, a Viking version of sour milk or yogurt. It's oddly satisfying, with a tang like plain kefir, and the same unsettling mouthfeel as drinking something that might fight back. Still, it's protein, it's calories. And if you're lucky, there's a thin skin of cream on top, almost sweet. And that counts as dessert. Alongside it, there's porridge, barley, or oats, boiled down to a thick pasty mush, sometimes mixed with milk, sometimes just water and salt. What elevates it? Nothing really. But on a cold winter morning, it fills your belly and warms your insides just enough to feel less like you're about to become a frost statue. Historians still argue whether Viking dairy practices were borrowed from neighboring cultures or developed independently in the harsh Nordic environment. Some point to early fermentation techniques, possibly introduced through trade with the Slavs or Celts. Others believe the climate itself shaped the dairy habits. Sour milk naturally emerged, so it was embraced. You eye a round lump of what looks like wax on the table. It's Mysingur, a cheese byproduct, something between a byproduct of whey and punishment. Dense, waxy, and sour beyond belief. But people ate it. Probably, while squinting and trying to think of anything else. The house matriarch ladles out warm, sour milk into little wooden bowls, setting each beside a chunk of cold porridge from the night before. Meals were often eaten cold in the morning to conserve firewood and effort. You eat slowly, chewing the same bite for minutes. It tastes like commitment. Then comes the highlight. Smør, Viking butter. If you were lucky or high status, you might have a tiny knob of it to melt into your porridge. Salty, creamy, made by hand, and churned from the goat's milk of animals you knew by name. You glance around the room. Children are licking their wooden bowls. Goats are bleating outside the door. And a dog with frost on its whiskers eyes your leftover porridge. You slide it toward him. He deserves it more. Despite its sour profile, Dairy was vital. It allowed the Vikings to stretch calories and nutrition when meat was scarce and vegetables were more memory than reality. The milk could be drunk, curdled, churned, or stored as cheese for leaner times. Some records even suggest they fermented it into mild alcoholic beverages, though modern reenactors have mostly decided that was a terrible idea. Still, dairy wasn't for everyone. Some archaeologists argue that Viking populations had varying levels of lactose tolerance, perhaps suggesting that dairy was more common among certain clans or regions than others. That might explain the strange silence from some longhouses when the word milk was mentioned. Back by the hearth, a child brings you a lump wrapped in birch bark. You unwrap it to find a smoky cheese studded with mysterious flecks. Ash, maybe, or herbs, or something that used to be alive. You take a bite. It tastes complex and slightly regretful. As you chew, you look out the slit window and spot a goat staring at you through the frost. She blinks, then walks off, unimpressed. You raise your cheese in tribute. Later, when the wind calms you, join the villagers outside to check the food cellars dug into the ground. Here, buried beneath layers of snow and hay, are clay pots of curdled milk, waiting patiently for their moment. Some have frozen solid. Some have taken on new colors. All of them, apparently, are edible. Technically, you wonder if the sour porridge will return for dinner. It probably will. You sigh. But for now, you're fed. You're upright. And you've survived another Viking morning with your dignity mostly intact and your taste buds only mildly offended. Your stomach makes a noise that sounds like it's unsure whether to digest or revolt. Breakfast is settling or staging a quiet rebellion. But there's work to be done. You shuffle across the longhouse floor and pass under a row of what looks like decorative shields nailed to the rafters. But they're not shields. They're bread. Viking bread. It turns out, wasn't quite the fluffy golden loaf you might dream of. It was thin, round, flat, and hard as a well-thrown axe. These flatbreads, made mostly of rye or barley, were baked in late summer or early autumn, then dried until they resembled discs of edible sandstone. People would literally hang them from the rafters to keep them safe from rats' mold and overly enthusiastic children. You reach up and knock one gently with your knuckles. It rings. Some Vikings soften the bread by soaking it in broth or milk before eating. Others just gnawed through the toughness like a dental challenge from the gods. There's a story told by a local farmer, half myth, half complaint, about a man whose tooth cracked so loud during breakfast that the goats stampeded. You sit on a bench near the hearth as someone saws a flatbread in half with a knife more suited to woodworking, crumbs spray, like gravel. The bread has a smoky scent from the fire, and it's laced with the familiar bitterness of rye and just a hint of ground tree bark. Yes, bark. During especially poor harvests, Vikings added birch bark flour to stretch their grain supply, not for flavor, unless you're very, very generous, but because it filled the stomach. Historians still argue whether the addition of bark was common practice or limited to moments of extreme hardship. Some say it was a regional method passed down by forest-dwelling communities. Others argue it's a myth born from misinterpretations of ancient recipes. You chewing the barky edge of a bread tile feel like the truth lies somewhere in between. And that truth tastes like slightly sweetened sawdust. The flour itself was rarely refined. Gritty coarse, sometimes containing fragments of stone from the grinding process. It gave Viking bread a signature crunch, not from crust, but from actual rock. Dental archaeologists have found heavy wear on Viking molars, likely from a lifetime of chewing these tiny geological hazards disguised as breakfast. A woman next to you hands over a slab of butter to smear on the bread. You nod gratefully, spreading it with your thumb. It melts, slowly, sinking into the bread's cratered surface, like rain in a dry riverbed. You take a bite. The butter helps a little. Next to the fire, a younger man toasts his bread by skewering it on a stick. It smolders briefly before catching fire. He laughs, drops it, stamps it out, then eats it anyway. You make a mental note not to let him cook anything else. Children pass through, grabbing hanging rounds like medieval frisbees and arguing over who got the least moldy one. There's a rhythm to this food, simple, repetitive, and stubborn, like the Vikings themselves. Bread might not have been glamorous, but it was always there, tough as nails, and nearly as sharp. At the far end of the room, you spot a rare treasure, a round of freshly baked barley bread, still soft and warm. It's for a visiting chieftain. You eye it with longing. The chieftain catches your gaze, smirks and tears off a piece to toss your way. It lands in your lap, steaming gently. You break it open, moist, nutty, almost sweet. A reminder of what bread can be before winter gets its hands on it. It's gone too soon, and you return to your trusty rafter biscuit. You chew slowly, rhythmically, your jaw setting into the pace of those who chew, not for pleasure, but for survival. And as your teeth grind over the second layer, you wonder if your ancestors had better bread, or just better dental insurance. You've barely swallowed the last bite of bread when someone hands you a cup. It's filled with a cloudy amber liquid that smells faintly of yeast and yesterday's socks. You sniff it cautiously. The man across from you grins and raises his own mug in salute. You drink its beer, but not like anything you've had before. Viking ale was weak by modern standards, barely alcoholic, slightly sour, and often served warm or at room temperature. It wasn't brewed for pleasure exactly. It was brewed because the water wasn't safe to drink. This was survival in a cup, and toddlers drank it too. Congratulations, you've joined the tiniest beer club in history. Brewed from barley water and wild yeast, plus whatever herbs or local weeds they thought might help. Viking beer was consumed daily. It was often cloudy, gritty, and occasionally bitter, depending on what got tossed into the cauldron. Hops weren't widely used yet, so instead they flavored their brews with juniper yarrow or even bog myrtle. Yes, an herb that sounds like it was discovered by accident in a swamp. You sip again. It's earthy, mildly sweet, and oddly refreshing, like a grain smoothie that decided to party just a little. Historians still argue whether Viking brewing was mostly done by women or men. Some say it was part of a housewife's regular chores, alongside milking goats and yelling at children not to eat the fish heads too early. Others believe there were specialized brewers who developed techniques passed down within families. Either way, ale wasn't a luxury. It was a daily essential. Across the room, a child tips back his mug of ale and wipes his mouth with a grin, then dives back into a game involving a goat and what appears to be a stick tied to a dead fish. The goat wins. You sit by the hearth and watch a woman strain another batch of brew through a cloth bag stuffed with straw and herbs. The smell is pungent, but oddly comforting, like old bread and warm wood. She ladles a bit into another cup and hands it to a visiting merchant who toasts her with a smile full of missing teeth. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was currency medicine, hospitality. You welcomed guests with ale. You honored the gods with ale. You tried to forget winter with ale. And if the fermentation went sideways, well, you drank it anyway and blamed the spirits. In the far corner of the longhouse, you spot a sealed barrel carved with runes. Someone explains, it's emjud, mead, made from fermented honey. Now that was the good stuff. But rare honey was difficult to find in the Nordic world, and a beehive raid in summer was a serious operation, often resulting in stings, shouting, and sweet victory. You're offered a thimble of the golden liquid. It glows in the firelight. You sip. It's warm, heady, and much stronger than the ale. This isn't for everyday drinking. This is for ceremonies, sacrifices, and making bold declarations about sea monsters or marriage. A joke floats around the table. Drink enough mead, and you'll think your fish stew is a banquet. You chuckle softly. The line hits a little too close. As you rest your cup, someone begins to sing a low rhythmic chant in Old Norse. It's a drinking song, possibly also a prayer, though no one seems quite sure. The children start clapping along the fire, flickers brighter, and the longhouse glows with the soft cheer that only ale and shared hardship can bring. You lean back, belly warm, head light. Around you, mug clink, jokes fly, and a goat tries to eat someone's tunic. Yes, Viking beer might be muddy and mild, but in this world of wind and stone, it's also comfort. It's company. It's a reason to sit together and tell stories, even if the stories are mostly about whose goat ate whose fish, and if your ale happens to be laced with juniper and optimism tonight, well, that's more than enough. The air outside has gone brittle with cold, sharp enough to make your nostrils sting. Yet here you are wrapped in a fur cloak, trudging along behind a hunched figure holding a woven basket and a crooked stick. You're not headed to a market or a neighbor's fire. You're going foraging. In winter, you might wonder what exactly there is to find when everything is either dead, buried under snow, or pretending to be dead to avoid being found. But the Vikings were resourceful. When food ran low, and it always did in winter, they went scavenging for whatever the forest could offer. Today's menu: moss, lichen, and bark. The woman ahead of you, tough wrinkled eyes like stone, kneels beside a patch of gray-green fuzz clinging to a tree trunk. She scrapes it gently with a knife, collecting the lichen in her basket. It'll be boiled into stew, or dried and ground into powder, not for flavor, but for bulk. One particular lichen, Iceland moss, was prized, high in carbs. It could be soaked, boiled, and added to porridge to make it slightly less tragic. But it came with a caveat: it needed proper preparation. Otherwise, it was bitter and mildly toxic. That was part of the Viking diet's charm. Eat wrong, and dinner might fight back. Historians still argue whether bark and moss were desperation foods or commonly integrated into seasonal cuisine. Some believe bark flour was a survival trick only used in famine years. Others point out archaeological evidence of birch and pine being regularly processed and added to meals, suggesting the line between innovation and necessity was blurry at best. You reach a fallen pine and watch as a boy scrapes the inner bark, the soft layer between wood and outer rind. This is the good stuff. Cambium. It's bitter and stringy, but it can be boiled dried and ground into a flour substitute. Mixed with porridge, It adds bulk and the flavor. Let's call it resinous surprise. Later back at the longhouse, a steaming pot bubbles gently. You peer in. Floating within are dark green strands, thin bark shreds, and a few peas, trying their best to stay relevant. Someone adds a ladle of milk and a pinch of salt. The smell is earthy, like soup, cooked in a wooden boot, but strangely satisfying. A young girl offers you a spoonful. You blow. Gently taste it. It's warm, chewy, slightly bitter, but filling, and that's what matters. Vikings didn't forage for luxury. They foraged because winter doesn't care if you're tired of eating tree. If it grew, didn't bite back, and wasn't glowing, it went in the pot. Occasionally, they'd find wild onions, garlic or roots that hadn't frozen through. These were rare treats, and people would talk for days about spotting a green sprig poking out from the snow. You once overheard a man say he saw a whole carrot, and everyone gasped like he'd found Thor's hammer. You finish your bowl and set it aside. A man nearby starts grinding dried moss with a stone pestle, muttering to himself. His hands are cracked from the cold, his sleeves stiff with salt, but his movements are patient, practiced. This is how you make winter survivable. One spoonful of bark-laced moss stew at a time. You remember a joke someone told earlier? If it grows on a rock and tastes like despair, we've probably eaten it. Everyone laughed. Then they went back for seconds. You settle back near the fire, full enough to feel it. Your breath fogs gently in the air. Outside, snow keeps falling. But inside, there's warmth food of a kind, and the stubborn determination of people who refuse to let a little thing, like an unforgiving climate, stop them from sitting down dinner. The fire crackles louder tonight. You're starting to suspect that's not entirely a good thing, because something just hit the pot with a splat. A particularly bold boy pokes at it with a stick, and a chunk of meat floats to the surface, glistening and vaguely eye-shaped. It's a sheep's head boiled. Welcome to one of the more memorable delicacies of Viking winter cuisine, civid, or preserved lamb's head. If you were hoping for something less intense this evening, say a nice salad or a piece of toast, you may need to recalibrate. The process is straightforward. Take the head of a sheep already cooked or cured, singe off the hair slice, it in half, lengthwise, scoop out the brain, if you're fancy, and boil it for hours. What you're left with is a steaming bowl of cheeks, tongue, eyeballs, and jaw meat, all seasoned by nothing but salt smoke and inevitability. You're handed a wooden spoon and a half skull. The eyes stare up at you. You stare back. The staring contest ends with you taking a very small, very brave bite. Surprisingly, the cheek meat is tender, almost buttery. There's collagen. There's gelatin. There's a strange sense of pride creeping in. Historians still argue whether svid was a common household dish or reserved for ceremonial occasions. Some sources suggest it was part of ritual midwinter feasts. Others say it was just another way to ensure no part of the animal was wasted. Either way, if there was meat on the bone, someone was boiling it. Preservation method varied. In some cases, the heads were buried in snow or ash, salted, or even fermented in sealed containers. That last one, a gamble. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it became more of a cautionary tale. Tonight's version is fresh as a decapitated, lightly smoked sheep's head can be. A woman next to you gleefully slurps the eyeball from her half and grins at you with the satisfaction of someone who knows every part of the animal has its purpose. even socket jelly. For the Vikings, meat was precious. Animals were often slaughtered in the autumn when fodder grew scarce. What couldn't be eaten fresh was cured, smoked, or buried. But during long, icy months, the fresh stuff ran out fast. That's where the odds and ends came in. Organs, feet, tails, heads, all of it went into stews, or was boiled solo for maximum yield. And while sheep were a staple, they weren't the only animals on the table. Pigs were rare, but treasured cows. When slaughtered, were feasted on like royalty. Horses, controversially, were sometimes eaten, though it depended on era, region, and religious influence. After Christianity spread, horse eating was frowned upon, sometimes even outlawed. You pause, spoon, hovering over a now silent eye cavity. A young girl dips bread into the broth and hums a happy tune. It's surprisingly peaceful. Like all of this is perfectly normal. And here it is. The bones are collected in a wooden bucket for later use, likely broth. Nothing gets thrown away. Even the tongue, which has a chewy richness to it, is shared around. Like treasure, you decline seconds, but accept a ladle of the broth, salty, fatty, smoky. It tastes like a barn in winter, but comforting too. A man at the end of the bench tells a story about a feast where they served pickled ram's testicles. You nod politely and try very hard to focus on the broth. Eventually, the heads are stripped clean. The skulls will be set aside for tools offerings, or possibly turned into decorative ladles. You can't tell if that's charming or horrifying. Probably both. Outside, the wind moans through the cracks in the walls. But inside the longhouse is full of warmth, laughter, and people gnawing on jawbones, like it's the best part of the year. And maybe it is, because in a world where winter wants you gone any meal, no matter how strange is a small defiance, a stubborn reminder that the Vikings didn't just endure, they chewed back. You finish your broth, set down your spoon, and sigh. You're full, slightly haunted, but definitely full. You wake to the bubbling of a pot that's been simmering since before sunrise. The air inside the longhouse is heavy with steam and scent, rich, meaty, and unmistakably communal. It's stew again, but not just any stew. This is grotter, the Viking equivalent of everything soup. There's no recipe, just whatever's left that hasn't spoiled. You shuffle over and peer in. Peas float alongside something vaguely root-shaped. Is it a parsnip? A turnip? Possibly a carrot from last month that got lost in a corner and re-emerged victorious. Chunks of meat bob lazily in the broth. Some are definitely goat. Others are suspiciously unidentifiable. There's a spine in there too. You decide not to ask questions. The communal cauldron was the beating heart of every Viking household during winter. Hung over the hearth, it never stopped cooking. New ingredients were added as they appeared. Old bones, dried fish, leftover milk, last night's porridge. Everything melded together in a constant bubbling stew that thickened over time and developed what generous people might call depth of flavor. You ladle some into a wooden bowl. It's steaming hot and smells like 5 different animals and 2 different decades. You take a sip. It's thick, savory, and surprisingly warming. Not bad. Actually, if you ignore the texture, the vague hints of smoke-soaked moss, and whatever that chewy bit was. Historians still argue whether this eternal stew method was a necessity born of poverty or an intentional culinary technique. Some point to similar practices in other ancient cultures, suggesting a shared human instinct for cooking what you have forever. Others believe it was simply the most efficient way to avoid dying with a full pantry. You glance around the longhouse. The The stew pot is a magnet. Children drag themselves over for a sniff and a scoop. Elders poke in strange herbs and mutter about balance. A dog licks his chops beneath it, hoping for drips. Even the goats get excited when someone starts stirring. It's the centerpiece of daily life. One man adds a handful of dried mushrooms, small shriveled things gathered before the first snow. Another drops in crushed acorns, boiled thrice to leach out the bitterness. There's no taste testing. The pot has its own logic now. It decides what it will become. You recall a story told last night. A woman claimed her grandmother's stew. Pot hadn't been emptied in over 7 years. Tasted like history, she'd said with a smile. And socks? The broth coats your throat, leaving a pleasant warmth. Somewhere in the pot, you suspect yesterday's fish is having a polite argument with last week's lamb, but they seem to be getting along. Outside, the wind picks up again. Snow pelts the walls like 1,000 tiny fists. You draw your cloak tighter and sip slowly. This stew might not win any awards, but it carries you. One spoonful at a time. It says you're still here. You're still warm. You still have something to eat. Later, someone ladles the dregs into a smaller pot to save for tomorrow. The cauldron is wiped down with hay, then reloaded more bones, more peas, more dreams. The cycle begins again. It's not gourmet. It's not glamorous, but it's alive. It's a story told in ladles, a memory made edible. And tonight, when the wind howls and the roof groans, that stew will still be there, bubbling, waiting quietly, declaring victory over the cold. The storm breaks sometime before dawn, and with it comes an eerie hush. Snowflakes drift like ash across the landscape, and everything is muffled beneath their weight. You're outside now, breath clouding before you, following a trail of shouting and excitement toward the edge of the fjord. And there it is, a whale, or at least what's left of one. Beached in the night, its massive form lies sprawled across the ice-strewn shore, black glistening and steaming slightly in the morning sun. A small crowd has already gathered. Men and women with knives, buckets and wide eyes stand around like they've discovered treasure. Because in a way, they have. A beached whale was a rare and glorious accident. In a time where winter feasts were more imagination than reality, stumbling upon tons of edible meat was nothing short of divine intervention. It didn't happen often, but when it did, the entire village mobilized like bees on spilled honey. You approach warily. The whale's eye is half closed, and its mouth gapes slightly, revealing a cathedral of baleen. Someone's already climbed onto its back and begun carving blubber flies in chunks, steaming in the cold. You're handed a knife, you decline politely. The meat, dark, oily, rich, is quickly portioned and hauled off in sleds, baskets, and cloaks. Strips of blubber will be boiled down into oil, used for lamps, and maybe even cooking. The flesh will be dried, salted, or roasted on flat stones. And if you're truly daring, there's always fermented whale, but that's a culinary adventure for another lifetime. Historians still argue whether Vikings actively hunted whales or only scavenged the beached ones. The sagas mention harpoons and boats, but physical evidence is rare. Some believe they occasionally targeted smaller species near shore. Others claim they waited for nature to do the work. Either way, when a whale appeared, it was all hands on deck. A boy skips past you with a basket of tongue meat grinning. Nearby, a woman carefully slices out a strip of blubber the size of a canoe. Everyone's smiling, talking, planning meals in excited tones. Tonight, there will be stew, there will be roasting, there might even be singing. You help carry a slab of meat back to the longhouse. the warmth of it seeping into your hands through your gloves. It smells faintly of fish and iron, but also of abundance. Inside preparations begin immediately. Whale steak grilled on flat stones, blubber boiled with onions, broth so dark it looks like night in a bowl. You're offered a taste. You take it. It's intense. The texture is dense, the flavor rich and fatty, but it fills you, warms you, reminds you that sometimes winter gives back. Of course, not everyone eats whale. A few villagers shake their heads and retreat to the fire, mumbling about spirits or sea curses. Some say whales are sacred. Others just say they're too chewy. But for most, this is a gift, a feast, a lucky break from the usual routine of dried fish and bitter porridge. By nightfall, the air inside the longhouse is thick, with smoke, laughter, and the unmistakable scent of meat cooking over fire. Children sit cross-legged, gnawing on greasy whale ribs. Elders sip broth with faraway looks in their eyes. And you recline beside the hearth belly, full of something that once swam in the deep. For one night winter feels a little less cruel. The longhouse is dim again, lit only by firelight, and the glow of a beeswax candle flickering near the carved godpost. You're sitting beside a heavy oak chest, fingers sticky from the last bite of whale blubber, when someone gently lifts the lid with a ceremonial air. Inside, honey golden thick and shimmering like a hoarded treasure, because in Viking households, honey wasn't just a sweetener. It was sacred, rare, and never wasted. Every drop mattered. Tonight, it's not going into porridge or bread. It's being spooned into a carved horn cup and mixed with warm water and herbs. This is a special occasion. You're about to sip something ancient, rare, and possibly magical mead. You take the cup carefully. It's warm in your hands, and the scent is both floral and earthy, tinged with pine and iron from the horn. You sip slowly. The flavor is rich and strange, fermented sweetness, with something bitter curling at the edge. It feels like drinking a toast to summer from the heart of winter. Historians still argue whether Vikings drank mead regularly or only on special occasions. Some sagas speak of mead halls flowing with it, while others suggest it was reserved for the elite, the chieftains, and the gods. Archaeological finds hint at both mead vessels turn up in graves, but most were small, too small for daily use, perhaps unless you had bees of your own. Beekeeping in the Viking world was common, especially in the colder northern reaches. Hives needed careful tending, and honey production was modest, which made every batch precious. In some regions, honey had to be traded or raided, imported from more temperate lands, where flowers weren't buried under snow for half the year. You dip your finger into the chest and swipe a tiny taste of raw honey. It's thick, slightly gritty, and wildly sweet. Compared to everything else you've eaten lately, it tastes like sunlight itself. Next to you, an old woman smears a bit onto a flatbread, folds it, and hands it to a child with reverence. A feast wrapped in bark-hard rye. But honey wasn't just for food and drink. It was medicine, too, mixed with herbs. It treated wounds and coughs, rubbed into cracked lips, dabbed on burns. It also had spiritual weight. Offerings to the gods sometimes included honeycombs, and it was said that fallen warriors in Valhalla drank mead from the udders of a magical goat. A bit unhygienic, perhaps, but undeniably mythic. As the cup of mead passes around the fire, the mood shifts. People soften. Songs begin, low, melodic chants about lost ships, summer fields, and the warmth of long-forgotten suns. You sip again, and the buzz of alcohol melts into the buzz of voices. Someone pulls out a tiny jar of honeycomb, carefully saved, still glistening. It's passed around like a jewel. You break off a corner, and the wax collapses between your teeth with a satisfying crunch. Sweetness floods your tongue. It's not just dessert, it's defiance. Here in a world of salted fish, sour milk, and bark porridge, a spoonful of honey is more than flavor. It's hope, it's memory, a promise that life once bloomed and will bloom again. You look around, the longhouse faces lit in flickering gold lips, sticky with sweetness, eyes shining with stories half remembered and songs half sung. The fire crackles, a child giggles, and for the first time in days, no one talks about tomorrow's meal. Tonight, it's enough just to sip to sing, and to let honey linger on the tongue, like a secret from summer, whispered into the heart of winter. The mead is gone. The fire is low, but the door creaks open again, and a blast of cold air brings with it the smell of travel, wet wool, and strong cheese. A guest has arrived, a trader judging by the worn cloak and the heavy satchel slung over one shoulder. Hospitality is sacred here. No matter the time or the state of your stew, a guest is fed. He bows, murmurs, greetings, and drops his offering on the table, a round wheel of goat cheese wrapped in cloth and smelling faintly of both promise and peril. You catch a whiff. It's sharp-aged and slightly judgmental. Vikings treasured visitors, not just for the stories they carried, but for the flavors. Trade routes stretched far, even in the winter, even across frozen rivers. And though long voyages were rare in the coldest months, some hardy souls moved between settlements, bringing gossip gifts and goods that hadn't been gnawed by rats or pickled beyond recognition. The guest unwraps the cheese with a flourish. It's cracked, veined with blue mold, and crowned with a strange gray fuzz that glows faintly in the firelight. This is Gamalost, or something like it, a pungent, soft, powerfully aged cheese believed to be both nutritious and slightly aggressive. You're offered a sliver. You take it. It's creamy, tangy, a little spicy on the back of the tongue, and very, very awake. You take another bite, just to be sure. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't. It's assertive. Cheese making was a skill passed through generations, especially among women. Made from sour milk and curds, often pressed into wooden molds and aged in root cellars or near the hearth. It provided essential protein and calories when meat was scarce. Some were mild and fresh. Others grew personalities. Historians still argue whether cheese was a luxury food or a survival staple. The sagas mention it sparingly, usually in passing perhaps because it was so ordinary, or perhaps because the odor made detailed descriptions difficult. But archaeological digs have uncovered cheese-making tools and even fragments of aged dairy fused to clay pots. The guest tells a story about a goat who once got drunk on spilled mead and ran through a snowdrift with a cheese wheel in its mouth. You laugh, not because it's necessarily true, but because it could be. And that's enough. Dinner resumes with quiet murmurs and soft chewing. Someone slices the last of the hard flatbread, smears it with cheese, and passes it around. The combination, sharp and dry, tangy and brittle, is unexpectedly perfect. The guest produces a few more treasures from his bag: dried apples, a handful of preserved lingonberries, and miracle of miracles, a lump of salt cured pork. The children whisper, as if he's pulled out a pouch of gold. This is what winter visiting is about, not just survival, but variety. Small, sharp joys in the endless monochrome of the season. You nibble a berry. It explodes in your mouth like forgotten summer. Later, the guest takes his place near the fire shoes, steaming as they dry. He hums a foreign tune. A woman responds with a melody of her own. And somewhere between the music and the scent of aged cheese, the longhouse feels a little more alive. You lean back, hands warm, belly full of strange delights and sour surprises. Outside, the snow continues to fall. But inside the fire dances, the stories stretch on, and the cheese is miraculously not finished yet. It's the darkest night of the year. The sun barely rose today, just blinked across the horizon like it was testing the air, then vanished again into cloud and dusk. But tonight, there's light. Candles flicker on every beam. Bits of tallow, glowing like stars in a wooden sky. A hush falls over the longhouse. Yule has come, and with it, the ceremonial meal. You sit cross-legged near the hearth, the air thick with smoke and expectation. Children hush each other. A woman hums an old chant under her breath. It's not just another winter dinner. Tonight is meant to mean something. Tonight is when you eat, not just to fill your belly, but to remind the gods you're still here. The feast begins with a bowl of jola grautur, a special porridge made barley and milk, richer than usual. Creamier, and nestled inside one lucky bowl, a single hidden nut, an almond or hazelnut. Whoever finds it is promised a year of good fortune, or at least the last chunk of butter. You dip your spoon and eat slowly. Warmth spreads down your spine. It's sweetened with a spoonful of honey, rare and golden. You glance around, hoping you're the lucky one. But across the fire, a boy shrieks in triumph. Mouth full and eyes wide, he found it. His sister groans. A small wrestling match ensues. Everyone laughs. Next come the ceremonial meats, simple, symbolic. A slice of dried lamb, a spoonful of whale stew, a cube of pickled fish. Each bite recalls a season, a story, a struggle. Nothing grand, but everything intentional. Then come the breads cracked, rye, smeared with butter, and a smear of lard. If you're lucky, some are dusted with crushed nuts or dried berries. Precious remnants saved from autumn's harvest. You chew slowly, thoughtfully. The bread is tougher than ever, but tonight it tastes like memory. Historians still argue whether Yule feasting traditions were purely Norse or a blend of Christian and pagan rites. The sagas reference midwinter blots, sacrifices to the gods with mead meat and chants. Later records mention Christian hymns and candlelight. Somewhere in the middle, people still gathered, still ate, still hoped. Across the room, someone raises a carved horn cup mead. A toast is spoken to ancestors, to harvests, to holding out one more year. You lift your own cup and drink. The mead is warm and sweet, tinged with smoke. It coats your throat like reassurance. After dinner, songs begin, soft, slow melodies that twine through the rafters like wood smoke. Someone taps a drum. A girl begins a story about a man who married a seal. Everyone leans in. You notice that the stew tonight has extra herbs, maybe even garlic. There's no fish skin, no bark. Someone added berries. Someone cared. It may be the best thing you've eaten all month. The fire is fed until it roars, and the longhouse glows like a lantern in the snow. Outside, the wind moans, but inside, the light holds. The voices hold. The food, humble as it is, fills something deeper than your stomach. You sip the last of your porridge, now cooled and thick. A whisper goes around. That one family roasted a bird, an actual bird, a duck, maybe even a goose. You didn't see it. You're not even sure it's real. But in the glow of Yule, anything feels possible. Tonight is not about indulgence. It's about defiance. It's about lighting candles in the face of the longest dark and saying we're still here. We still sing. We still cook stew and hide nuts in porridge and laugh when children argue over them. And when the fire finally dims and you lie back on your straw mat, full of warm milk and salt and smoke, you feel it, a flicker of comfort, of peace, of survival, wrapped in ritual. You're not just eating, you're witnessing winter's turning point. The morning after Yule is quiet, not solemn, just slow. The fire smolders instead of blazes. People move with the kind of satisfied weariness, like they've lived 10 winters in one night and earned a little stillness. You make your way to the back of the longhouse, into the pantry space. Though pantry might be too modern a word for what's essentially a set of shelves, barrels, clay jars, and bundles suspended from beams. This is the domain of the Viking woman of the house, and you step in with a sense of reverence. She's there already, a cloth wrapped around her head, hands dusted in flour, sorting through what remains. Every jar is like a chapter in the winter story. Each ingredient, a line of defense in the quiet battle against hunger. A basket holds the last of the onions. Dried herbs hang like forgotten prayers. In a clay pot, preserved, berries float in thick syrup, only tapped on rare days. You see sacks of cracked barley sprouted in one corner from a leak in the roof. She sighs, scoops the dry half into a bowl, and carries on. Waste is not an option. She lifts a lid from a wooden tub. Inside, root vegetables submerged in brine, rutabagas, parsnips, the occasional turnip. The smell is vinegary and sharp, and your eyes water slightly, but the roots are firm, preserved well. These boiled down with a scrap of fat or a dash of butter can still be made into something resembling a meal. Historians still argue whether Viking women controlled the entire food operation or merely oversaw it, while men hunted, traded, or raided. But evidence, artifacts, sagas, household structures suggests the domestic hearth was their stronghold. They dried, pickled, salted, smoked, and sometimes enchanted. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was knowledge, skill, and quiet power. The woman beside you stokes the coals, then adds twigs soaked in birch sap. A sweet scent rises. She's making the morning gruel smell like spring. She ladles out breakfast, a mix of barley, sour milk, dried apple slices, and a single strand of honey on top. She doesn't smile exactly, but her eyes do. You accept it like a blessing? Then she does something curious. She sprinkles a bit of ash into the fire from a small jar. Not just any ash. You're told it's from the Yule log saved and dried from last night. A protection ritual, a wish, a continuation. Fire rituals were part of daily life. Lighting the hearth each morning was symbolic, inviting warmth, banishing spirits, drawing strength from the gods of the flame. The hearth was the center, not just of cooking, but of memory. When you sat beside it, you weren't alone. Ancestors were there. Stories too. You sip your gruel and stare into the flames.